Hello. I am John Beckman, Professor John Beckman, Dr. John Beckman, the father of Elaine, the transgenic mother of sin, your hostess with the mostess. All right. Today we're going to be doing more kid biology. So remember last time we talked about atoms?
Mm-hmm.
And atoms, there's different types of atoms. And there's a whole bunch that constitute the periodic table of elements.
Mm-hmm.
You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so from here, this is a water molecule. What did we learn about molecules?
That molecules is oxygen and hydrogen.
No.
Well,
those are atoms.
Okay.
What are molecules?
Is it like the negative and the positive?
No. Okay, so atoms are the individual elements. So in this molecule, there are hydrogen atoms and oxygen atom. Molecules are combinations of atoms. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So to review, there's different types of atoms, and they come together like building blocks to form different molecules.
Okay.
So the lowest level is atom, and then above that is molecule. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So since we're focused on biology, there's a few atoms that are very important for biology that occur and help facilitate life and living things. Okay. And remember how we talked about humans are essentially bags of water. We're like 70% water. So water is a very special molecule. Okay, so here's water. It's an oxygen and two hydrogens. So if you've ever heard H2O, it's because there's two H's and an oxygen.
Okay.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So to understand why water is special, you have to understand a little bit deeper level of atoms. So remember how we talked about the atomic structure? There was a nucleus, and then these electrons sort of like fly around it, almost like planets.
Yeah.
Okay. Planets like orbiting around the sun. So sometimes, depending on where the electrons are, things can be more negative or less negative. So like more negative or positive. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So if there were too few electrons, would it be positive or negative?
Negative?
No. Okay, so electrons are negative. This is actually kind of a hard question.
Okay.
Electrons are negative.
Okay.
So if there were too few electrons, would it be positive or negative?
Positive.
Yeah, it would be positive. And if there were too many electrons, it would be negative. Yeah. So essentially, like when you see molecules like this, there's two different ways to show you how they're constructed. One way is sort of like this way where these represent chemical bonds. Bonds is when the atoms are sharing electrons. So there's a nucleus for hydrogen and there's a nucleus for oxygen. And the electrons are kind of like orbiting like this. Like they're kind of, oh no.
I knew it was.
When there's a chemical bond, what that means is that two atoms are actually sharing electrons. So instead of the electrons just orbiting one, they're actually floating around like this. They're spinning around these nuclei like this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so that means there's a chemical bond holding these atoms together. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Why don't they hold the other hydrogen?
This one?
Yeah.
This one is also in a chemical bond with this oxygen, and so its electrons are moving around like this.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So chemical bonds, that's when it's sharing electrons. Okay? And that holds the pieces together. It holds the structure together, so it can't like come apart. Does that make sense? So bonds are like a physical, permanent sort of like glue that is holding chemicals together. Okay? Now, this is one way to show you how water molecule is, okay? Where it's showing you the bonds and it's showing you the atoms. Another way to visualize atomic structure is these sort of like balls. And these balls, this one, red one is oxygen. We can label it. This one is oxygen. And these ones are hydrogens. And here you're seeing what's called an electron cloud, which is, this is the actual volume that the electrons take up. So the electrons are spinning around here, taking up this volume. Does that make sense?
Yes.
But these are the same thing. They're just showing you two different like ways to visualize it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So more about water. Water is a very special molecule, and it's super important for understanding life, and it's super important for how life evolved or came about. Okay. And the reason that water is special is that water is polar. Do you know what that means?
No.
Have you ever heard like to be polarizing?
No.
Okay. Polar means like it means one way to say it would be you're charged. Another way to say it would be you're plus or negative. Another way to say it would be that it's almost kind of like if you think about you're this or that, like it's like this is very difficult to explain polar. I'm thinking, like, what would be the best analogy? Like people who make you really, really mad, they're polarizing, and people who you love are polarizing. And then there's people who you just don't care about. They don't make you upset, and they don't bother you. They're just kind of like, does it make sense?
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by water. Water is either kind of like it's a molecule, and you either love it or you hate it. You either hate it or you love it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's actually like a good way to understand water. And so polar molecules are very special because they cause a lot of things to happen. Because again, like other molecules either love them or hate them. So they're either coming close or running away from them. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, and whether you're polar or not depends on where the electrons are. So if you look at this atomic structure, it's got this little weird D and it says negative. Mm-hmm. This is a Greek letter delta, and it's just saying this part of the water molecule is negative, and this part of the water molecule is positive. So positive charge tends to kind of like sit on these two hydrogen lobes, and negative charge seems to kind of sit on this oxygen. That's sort of like how it works out. Okay. And so the weird thing about water is it's both positive and negative. It's like you can both like it and hate it at the same time, depending on how it's floating or how it's oriented. Does that make sense? Yeah. Like if you were like this side, maybe there's too many electrons for you and you want to get away. But if you move around to this side, then the charge changes and it's positive. And so you're more okay on this side. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So however it sort of is like spinning or orienting changes its relation to other molecules. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay.
So this is kind of really complicated, but I can try to sort of finish with an example that I think will make more sense. Okay, so there's another type of molecule that's very important in biology, which is called a phospholipid. Okay. Phospholipid. And this is also a molecule that has sort of like two parts of it. This part is called hydrophobic. Phobic means you don't like, and hydro means water. So this part of the molecule hates water. Okay. It hates water. And this part of the molecule is hydrophilic. Philic means it likes. Okay. So this part of the molecule likes water. Okay. And so if you take this molecule, like we can simplify this. So let's just draw it like this. Okay. Or you can even just draw it like this. This part of the molecule likes water, and this part of the molecule hates water. Okay. And if you have like a cup of water, okay, you have essentially like a bunch of water molecules floating around in that water. Does that make sense? Like, so if you actually have a cup of pure water, if you just have pure water, it's literally just a big pile of molecules that look like this. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Now what happens when you throw these molecules into a cup of water where a part of it likes water and a part of it hates water? I'm curious, what do you think would happen if you take a molecule like this and you throw it in water?
I don't really know.
Well, what do you think? Like a part of it likes it and a part of it hates it. Like, I'm curious, what would be your guess?
It would probably just be like, I don't know.
It would have to try to orient itself in a way where the things that like water are bound to the water and the thing that hates water are shielded from the water. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So if you take a bunch of these, okay, so a bunch of these molecules that look like this, right?
Yep.
So these are different. These are the phospholipids.
Mhm.
Phospholipids. And you take a pile of water, which is essentially like a glass full of water, and you throw these phospholipids in the water. What they do is they form these structures that look like this.
Okay.
Guess why they do this?
So like the part that hates water is like away from the part that loves water, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Like the part that hates water is shoved inside.
Okay.
It's protected from the water.
Okay.
And the part that likes water is outside, exposed to the water. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So it looks essentially like this. They form these very organized lines in a way where the part that hates water is protected inside,
Okay.
but the part that likes water is outside touching the water. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And if you have a whole bunch of these, guess what they form? They form spheres all the way around. So I can get a picture of this to show you. Here's one picture. This is a picture of a flat plane. Let me get a picture of, let me get the 3 different geometries. Okay, so I want to show you, so this is just sort of like the one-dimensional idea. The simple idea is that the parts that like each other and hate water come inside, and the parts that like water are on the outside. And at a larger scale, they can form these long surfaces. Does that make sense? Yeah. And actually what they form are 3-dimensional spheres in the water, where inside of the sphere, guess what's inside of the sphere? Nope. So it's a layer. So it's not this that's inside.
Oh.
This is making a whole sphere. So this part right here is this part right here. So guess what's inside of the sphere? In here. Guess what's inside? So it would be underneath right here. This part of the molecule, guess what it likes? This part.
This part of the molecule likes.
Remember, look at the diagram. This part likes water. That means this part likes water. And this part inside hates water. Okay, so now extend that to here. This part hates water. And this part like water. So guess what's underneath right here?
The ones that hate water?
No, that's the part that's inside. It's like a sandwich with 2 layers of bread. Do you understand? The meat inside is like the part that hates water, and the 2 bread pieces are the part that like water. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So what is here underneath?
Water?
Yes. Good. Water. And guess what's up here?
I'm thinking. Water?
Yes. Exactly. So now extend this thinking to here. What's inside of the sphere?
Water.
Water. And what's outside the sphere?
What? Oh.
Water. So this is a bag of water inside of water. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And guess what this is called?
Water.
This is a cell.
Okay, so.
This is a cell. It's a vesicle. A vesicle. A vesicle is essentially a sphere filled with water.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Yes. And this is the first step to understanding biological life, because all biological living organisms are essentially bags of water that look like this. And this is how you build them. You take these molecules that half of it likes water, half of it doesn't like water, and you throw them in water, and they spontaneously form these bilayer surfaces that form spheres, bags filled with water inside of the water. Does that make sense?
Yes, now I'm starting to understand it.
Yes. So your body, if you were to look at the smallest level of your body, it's essentially bags of water inside of water. And there's a whole bunch of different interesting things that are inside here that we'll talk about later.
Okay.
But you just need to understand now two things. So let's summarize the take-homes. Take-homes. Water is special.
Water is special
Because it's polar.
because it's polar.
Polar means you love it or you hate it. There are phospholipids. Phospholipids they have two parts. Part 1 likes water.
Nice water. Part 2.
Part 2 hates water.
And then
Okay. And when you throw them together, when you mix phospholipids with water, they form these like sandwiches where this. Hang on, let me spell this correctly. Maybe I'll be able to spell. Oh, it's not even going to hint it to me. Sandwiches. Yep. They form sandwiches that form spheres filled with water. And that's what bags. That's when I say bags of water. That's what I mean. Does that make sense? Yes. And those are cells. And that's what we'll talk about next time, maybe. Okay. Cells. Good?
Yep, good.
Okay.
It's gonna fall.
You knew that was going to happen. We'll have to edit this out.
Yeah.
It's okay. We can do that.
We can just put that in the bloopers.
For shit's sake. We got to do it this way.
Yeah.
Okay. So, okay.